This video will provide a brief overview first of how a secondary teacher might use a gradebook in Schoology to implement equitable grading and instructional practices, and then how a teacher might set up a gradebook like this, what some of the key features are in order to do that. So we're currently looking at a gradebook, and you can see we've got some students in this class and a number of assessment items recorded already. You might notice that all of the assessments are recorded using a proficiency-based scale, a 0 through 4 scale. And you might also notice that even though we've got assessments recorded, we don't have any calculated grades for the students yet. So right now we're looking at a bunch of assessments together, but a great thing about an EGI aligned gradebook is that we can just focus in on one learning target. So I'm going to go here to all materials and bring it down to just learning target 1. And if I look at learning target 1, now I see that there are a total of 5 assessments for that learning target. I can see if we take a look at this first student, the student scored a 1, and then on the next assessment a 2, 2, 3, 3. And you can see over here, I've got a final column called LT1 Mastery, and here's where I'm going to look at the body of evidence, the scores that the student has demonstrated on this learning target, and I get to enter a proficiency level here. So based on these scores, I would say the last 2 are 3s. I have pretty clear evidence that this student is now proficient. I would enter a 3 here for the mastery score, and you can see now I've got a calculated grade for the student. I can do the same thing for my other students. I would have to determine whether I think this student is a 2 or a 3. I might enter a 3 here. And here I can see a student's got 3 assessments with 2s, 2 assessments that were not turned in. Still, there's enough evidence to say that this student is at currently a 2 level understanding. So I would enter that there. I might take a look at another learning target. Here I can see I don't yet have any assessment scores for learning target 2, so I wouldn't enter a mastery score yet. I know for learning target 8, I have additional scores. So here I can see it was assessed twice, and this student scored a 4 on both assessments, so I might enter a 4. Here the student scored a 2 and a 3. If the teacher were not certain yet whether the student was actually at a proficient level, they might choose to enter a 2, otherwise they might enter a 3, and this is a score that can always be updated with additional evidence. And here a little bit less certainty around this student's current level of proficiency. As a teacher, I would need to think about what these assessments are in determining that proficiency score. You can see now that I've entered scores in this learning target mastery column as well. The gradebook has taken those 2 different mastery scores. So if you remember, this first student had a 3 on the first learning target and a 4 on this learning target, and those are averaged together to determine this current letter grade. Averaging would not be as problematic here with looking at final proficiency levels in various learning targets. It would not be the same thing as averaging within a learning target over time. So that's looking at the gradebook, how we might use it. If I go to the student grade report, I can see from the student and family lens, they get to see a learning target with the assessment scores that the student scored on related to that learning target, and finally the mastery score related to that target. So they can see I scored these scores on my assessments, and that's why I currently have a 3 for learning target 1. Same thing for learning target 8. I can see my 2 assessment scores and then the mastery score there. And then finally, you'll notice the student just gets an overall course grade reported here. They're not seeing that percentage that we saw in the teacher view in the gradebook. So that's a quick overview of how a teacher might use this gradebook. We're going to quickly look at how you would set it up. So if I go to my grade setup page, one of the key things that I have to do in order to use my gradebook like this is enter my learning targets as categories in the gradebook. You can see I've got all those categories here, all my 10 learning targets. I've got some additional categories where I can enter non-academic scores, and those would not be used in determining the academic grade. So that's one key thing, adding those learning targets as categories in the gradebook. A second key thing is developing a proficiency-based scale rather than a percentage-based scale. So I've got this proficiency-based scale here. It's got very simple descriptors. So a 4 would be advanced, 3 is proficient. I can create this scale and then set it as my default scale so that all assessments are using that scale. I've also got a second scale that is a percentage-based scale, and this is strictly used to do conversions. So at the end, if in looking at all of a student's learning targets, they end up with a 3, this scale would take that and convert it to an overall letter grade of B. So this is just a scale used to do the conversions, and I would set this scale to my final grade settings so that it can do that conversion at the end of the grading period. And a final thing that I have to do when I'm creating materials in this gradebook, all of my assessments that I've entered, so here's one, the Unit 3 test. If I were to look at this assessment, all of these assessments are created with a factor of 0, and that allows me to record the evidence and scores on those assessments without those assessments being averaged together to determine a student's grade on a learning target. My mastery columns, those ones where we were entering the proficiency level, if I were to look at those still do have a factor of 1, and that's what gave them the weight in the final grade and what allows those mastery columns to be averaged together for that final grade.